As an instructor, there are few topics that I can think of that students dislike studying more than they dislike studying MLA documentation style. In fact, when I mention in a face-to-face class that we're going to be talking about MLA style for the day, I often can hear an audible groan from my students. Like I've just told them that we're going to be doing a 10-mile run in class, uphill. I guess I understand their frustrations with MLA style, their hesitation regarding the rules of MLA style. And I think, in fact, it's not really the student's fault that they feel this way. I think that a lot of the blame has to go to the teachers who have taught MLA style in a particular way. Students often come to the conclusion, based on the way teachers approach MLA style, that the style is just it's a hoop to jump through. In other words, it's a requirement that a teacher puts on the paper that is very important to the teacher, and it's very, very specific. The teacher usually has very specific requirements for what that documentation will look like. And the teacher often spends little or no time discussing why this requirement is there in the first place. It's just one of those things that teachers care about, and students don't really understand why, but they learn to follow it, or they learn to hate it more frequently. I think that if we take a step back from the way MLA has been taught in the past and start thinking about why it exists, why the requirements for MLA style exist in the way they do, I think, first of all, it'll be easier to follow those requirements. But I also think, and maybe this is more important, that it'll be less awful, I guess. It'll be less unpleasant for you. So what I hope to do in this lecture is cover some of the requirements of MLA style, although most of them are covered in your textbook, and I'll direct you to the section of your textbook that deals with them. But more importantly, I want to talk about the rationale for MLA style. I want us to think about why we do it, and see if that can't change our attitude towards the style a little bit. I guess to start with, let's think about the name of the style. I'm always surprised how few teachers how many teachers focus on the details of MLA style very much, but never talk about what the letters stand for. MLA stands for the Modern Language Association, which is really just a professional organization that teachers of English literature and language belong to. And that's important to understand a little bit because it points to the idea that this is just one style of many different documentation styles that are out there. In fact, you may have learned to use other styles in other classes. So, for example, many history classes or psychology classes might use APA style, which stands for the American Psychological Association style. So there's nothing magic about MLA style. There's nothing that makes it the right thing to do. It's rather just a convention that we've decided to follow in certain fields, and specifically in English in this case. But I guess we need to take even one more step backwards. What does style mean? Well, MLA style or MLA format is simply a way of writing papers, specifically a way of writing papers that use source material. In fact, there are a lot of aspects of MLA style that you probably have never had to worry about, or maybe you have and resented them just as much. Things like the style of the heading on your paper, or how big the margins should be, or what kinds of fonts to use. And that stuff is part of the style, but it's not something that I care about, not something that I'm going to require you to follow. And in fact, it's not what most students mean when they talk about MLA documentation style. They mean the rules for documenting and citing sources in your paper. And that's the most important part of MLA style, and certainly it's the part that you'll need to know and understand a little bit for your last paper in the class. But the question remains why we need documentation styles at all. Now, that might seem like a self-explanatory question. You've been taught for a long time that you need to give credit to your sources. But I think that it's really important that we understand that when we document sources, when we tell the readers about the sources we've used, we're doing so for two different reasons. First of all, there's the ethical reason, and this is what teachers generally focus on and what students generally understand about documentation, is that it's somehow dishonest to use information, ideas, certainly words, in a paper without giving credit to the original author of that information. And it's true that when you write, you have an ethical obligation, both to your sources and to your readers, to be clear and upfront about where you've used sources. But there's another reason for providing documentation that I think we forget about a lot of the time, and it's a practical reason. In other words, we give information about sources not just so we can give credit to the authors, but so that our readers can find that information if they need to. And there's any number of reasons why they might need to. They may have questions about the information that we've provided, and they might want to look it up. They may not understand the points we've made, and the source might clarify some of that information. Or they might just be interested in the subject and want to know more about it. In any of these cases, the documentation that we provide will help the reader get the information they need. I like to point out these two different rationales for documentation and for MLA style because they relate to the way MLA style works overall. Because MLA style is a two-part system. In other words, there's two different things that we need to do when we document sources in MLA style, and those two different things are related to the two rationales behind documentation in general. The first part of MLA style occurs when we use the source in the paper. In other words, we're writing a sentence. In that sentence, we've included information, ideas, maybe the exact words of a source, but maybe not. Maybe we've put them in our own words. The important thing is that the information in the sentence comes in some way from a source. When we do that, then we have to provide at the end of that sentence a citation, a little note to tell the reader, hey, I've used a source here. This information is not entirely my own. So what we provide is called an in-text citation. Sometimes it's called a parenthetical citation or a parenthetical reference because it's inside parentheses at the end of your sentence. And the in-text citation, which goes at the end of the sentence, fulfills your ethical obligation. But one look at a standard MLA-style citation should tell you that it does not fulfill your practical obligation. In other words, because an in-text citation contains very little information about the source, normally only the last name of the author followed by a page number, if you have it, and we'll come back and talk about that requirement in just a little bit. But because that's the only thing that's included, we haven't really given the reader any information, or at least not enough information, about how they can find that source themselves. If we're using a source by someone named Johnson and we're using page 172 so that our in-text citation says something like Johnson 172, well, the reader would need a lot more information than that to find the specific source. This leads us to the second part of MLA style, which is the Works Cited page. Now, the Works Cited page is the part of MLA style that students generally hate the most. This is the part with all the very specific formatting requirements. But it's important to understand that the reason we have to provide all of the specific information in the Works Cited entry is to give the reader the information they need to find that source with no question, to find it easily. It's only in the combination of the in-text citation and the Works Cited page that we fulfill our obligations for documentation. In other words, if we have a Works Cited page, but we don't cite any of those works in the paper, we don't provide parenthetical citations for them, then we've only given practical information. We've told the reader, hey, this is some sources I've used. You can go look at the information there. But we haven't told the reader which information specifically in the paper comes from those sources. And as a result, we're sort of taking credit for that information ourselves. So we haven't fulfilled our ethical obligation. On the other hand, if we have all in-text citations throughout the paper, but we don't have a Works Cited page, well, we've covered the ethical side of documentation. We've told the reader, I've used a source here. What we haven't done is made it easy for the reader to find that source if they have more questions about it or want to do further reading in it. So it's extremely important that we try to fulfill both sides of that equation, that we try to clearly tell the reader when we've used sources through our in-text citation, and then give the reader the information they need on the Works Cited page to find those sources. Now, I do want to talk briefly about the format of both the in-text citation and the Works Cited page, because it's usually the format that gives students specific trouble. The format of the in-text citation is actually pretty easy, though it's not probably what you've been told. It's certainly not what I told you a few minutes ago. I said a few minutes ago that the in-text citation normally includes the author's last name and the page number. And in fact, neither of those things is necessarily true. The in-text citation, the key to it, is to link it clearly to the entry on the works cited page that you're using at that time. Now, the easiest way to do that is to put in that citation whatever the works cited entry begins with. Now, it's true, most of the time, MLA-style entries begin with an author's last name. In fact, anytime there is a named author, that's what starts the works cited entry for that source. So most of the time, it is the author's name that goes in the parentheses, but that's only because that's what starts the works cited entry. If something else starts the works cited entry, as sometimes happens, we'll talk about in a minute, then that would go in the parenthetical citation. The idea is that you want that citation to immediately point the reader toward the right source on the works cited page if they need to look it up. And the second part of the citation, which is the page number we see listed here, that obviously only applies if you're using a print source, if you're using a source that has a page number. Since so much research that's done now by students is done online, often there is no page number included. So the real rule for the citation is that it should contain, first of all, whatever starts the works cited entry for that source, whether it's the author's name or a version of the title, and then a page number if a page number applies. If there is no page number, then there's no reason to include it. Now, one little note, some things that don't belong in the in-text citation. We don't need to put any other information than just the author's name or whatever starts the works cited entry and possibly the page number. Sometimes students for online sources, for example, want to put the web address of the source. And the web address does go in the works cited page, but on the actual paper, in other words, in the in-text citations, in my opinion, those web addresses just sort of clutter up the page, especially web addresses that are longer. So you really want to save the web address for the works cited entry, not the in-text citation. Okay, well, that was pretty easy. In-text citation goes at the end of the sentence, technically before the period, and includes one or two things: the first word of the works cited entry, and then possibly a page number. The works cited entries, of course, are more complicated, and they're really, when some students say MLA style or they talk about how much they hate MLA style, they're really talking specifically about the works cited entries, because this is the part of MLA style that can get very specific. In fact, in your textbook, there's a section that deals with different rules for formatting works cited entries for different kinds of sources in MLA style, and it starts on page 579 and goes, looks like through page 589, so it's a little over 10 pages worth of material broken up into different kinds of sources: how you cite a book, how you cite a newspaper article, how you cite a magazine article, how you cite different kinds of online sources. And it's all those choices and then the strange format of those choices that can give students some pause. But I don't want you to worry about the format of the works cited entry. At least don't worry about it as much as many students do. First of all, there is sort of a common thread in all of these different entry formats. All the entries have a basic structure, which is the author's name, followed by the title of the source, followed by some kind of publication information. Now, for a book, that may be the author's name, followed by the title of the book, followed by publication information for the book, like the place of publication, the name of the publishing company, and the date of publication. For other kinds of sources, it may be the publication information may be different. So if it's a newspaper article, you might need the author's name, the title of the article, and then where that article was published. In other words, what newspaper it was published in, which issue, in other words, which day the newspaper came out, and what page of that particular issue that article is found on. So even though the two formats look different, and that is the format for citing a book looks different than the format for citing a newspaper article, the basic idea is the same. It's still starting with the author and the title and then publication information about that that source. And all MLA formats follow that same basic formula. They all start with an author's name if you have one. They move on to a title if there is a title, and they move on to some kind of information about where the source comes from, where it's been published. Now, a lot of students and a lot of teachers, to be frank, get bogged down in the details of MLA style. How do you format this kind of source or that kind of source? What about a website that doesn't have an author? What about a journal article that has 3 authors' names? Which order do you put them in? And I'm not saying that you shouldn't try to follow the standards of MLA style. But in my opinion, those details are, well, they're just that. They're details. They're not what's really important. What's important is that you document your sources clearly, unambiguously, so the reader always knows where you're using a source and can always tell what that source is and where to find it. Now, at this point, it's important to understand what using a source means. And using a source means just that. Any use of a source must be documented. Sometimes students believe that only sources that have been quoted directly have to be documented, but in fact that's not true. Any information at all that comes from a source, whether it's an idea or just a fact that you found in a source, or if it is a direct quotation, any of those things have to be fully cited. You have to put the in-text citation after them, and you have to have a works cited entry to correspond with that citation to tell the reader more about that source. That's really the most important thing about documentation. It's not about the details of how you format the works cited entries, although you should try to follow the guidelines that start on page 579 in your textbook. But you shouldn't be spending a lot of time on this. Just quickly look up the kind of source you're dealing with, find the format, type that in. There's actually websites online that can help you with that if you want. And then focus on the bigger question, which is, have you clearly and ethically told your reader where you're using sources? And have you given them the information they need to find that material if they want to? Now, if you have any questions at all about documentation and what the standards are, or how to follow the standards, or how to format a particular source even, I'll be glad to help you with that. You just got to let me know. Thanks.